Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. No matter what part of the world you're joining us from, welcome. Welcome to AI Diet World 2021 Day 2. I hope you enjoyed the excellent lineup of speakers on day 1. We heard so many great food for thought and from speakers like Christina, Betsy, Catherine, um, who else? Eric, Kurt, Tulsi, like what a great lineup of speakers. And I had so much food for thought. I learned something new. I hope you did as well. I can't wait to get started on our day 2. We have again a fabulous lineup of speakers. And our keynote is going to be Mike Boufford, who is the CTO of Greenhouse Software. Let me introduce Mike. Mike is the founding engineer and the CTO of Greenhouse Software, the makers of hiring software leveraged by over 5,000 companies, from SMBs to the Fortune 500. And if you ever wanted to know how AI is being used for hiring today, I know there is so much of discussion. It is such a hot topic in today's world on how AI is being used for hiring, positives, false negatives, all of that stuff. How are we making algorithms better and more accurate so that we are fair to people, we are inclusive, and all of that good stuff. So keep your questions ready. I know this fireside chat is going to be on fire. Let me bring Mike on stage.
Hello,
Mike.
Thanks so much for having me.
Welcome, Mike. I'm sure you are also as excited as I am. I think this is the biggest topic of conversation in our times today. Like, I know there's all sorts of things that AI is doing, but hiring is the things that also affects so many people directly.
Yeah, I mean, hiring is one of the most consequential things that that happens in a person's life, and it winds up setting up the trajectory for not just them and their lives, but future generations. If your parent gets a great job that provides stable living and they feel engaged and happy in their work, that's going to translate into better success for the next generation, the next one after that. So there's few things that are equally as consequential as hiring.
Absolutely, completely agree with you. So I know we only have 30 minutes and we have so many things to cover, so I'm going to jump right in. How is AI helping talent acquisition managers automate an array of time-sucking tasks today, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I think in some cases it's helping, and in some cases it's probably reinforcing bad behaviors. So maybe we can start there. And the fact that this is an ethics conference, I think we should probably dive into some of those things. So what's the fundamental problem? I'm a recruiter. I have a job that's really desirable, and let's say that I have 1,000 people apply to a job, or I'm going to hire one person. This is not the most common thing. Usually you might have 80 or 100 people or something like that. But let's say you have 1,000 people apply to some job. How do you whittle down the pile? When you think about the interview process, there's a bunch of different steps. So like the first thing that you do is you figure out who should enter the pile. Like, where should I advertise it? Who should I go reach out to? Should I throw an event to try to attract people to come? So there's a huge range of different things you do to try to source somebody initially. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that people are doing now is they're leveraging these AI tools to go out and try to find the list of candidates that they should reach out to. So they're asking these tools to take the criteria that they think are important to the role. So let's say somebody has some experience in Java, or they've worked at a company for more than 5 years, or they've worked at a specific competitor where they think they're going to have some valuable insights into this type of work. There are companies that are building tools that are going out and trying to find candidates. So not all of that is necessarily leveraging what we might call AI. A lot of it's just, let me go look and see if these keywords are present for this person. But they're getting increasingly sophisticated, and they are leveraging certain types of models that you might say are closer, or certainly are machine learning based. So one thing that they're doing in particular, which I think is sort of questionable whether it's something that we should be doing, is taking a look at people's LinkedIn photographs, taking a look at their names and running them through models that will assess whether they are of a particular race or gender. And the intention for companies is to try to identify people who would add diversity to their teams and try to bring them on board. So the intention is in some ways very good. At the same time, they're leveraging tools that can create like a real classical ethical conundrum in how we automatically assign labels to people. The last thing I'll say on that particular point is people are doing the same thing. And so one of the problems with AI in recruiting is that it's usually reinforcing whatever the thing is that the person is doing. So if the person's going out in LinkedIn and looking and guessing, is this person going to add diversity to my team or not? The AIs are doing things in a different way, but coming to their successes is whether they come to a similar conclusion as to what a human might.
Yeah. So, Mike, I think you touched upon automated sourcing a little bit, right? I know we talked about it, and you talked about how, and this also brings into the human behavior that is being used for sourcing, and that's amplified through the AI tools.
I'm sorry, the mic got a little poppy for a sec. Could you just repeat?
Yes. So I was saying that there is an echo on your side, Mike.
It's coming from my side. Sorry about that. Let's see if this solves it.
Hello.
How about now?
I think that's better.
Hold on. Okay. I'm not sure. Let me. I hear some crackling coming out of my speaker, so not sure what it is. I'll try to mute in between things I say.
Okay, no worries. I was saying it sounds to me like the human behavior is now being amplified through these tools, whether we use AI tools or the algorithms to do the same task. But humans are doing the same thing, right? I mean, in an effort to bring more diversified people to hire and to bring teams, we are doing that. We are looking at their profiles on LinkedIn. We are making sure that, we are going to the other part of the things, whether, it's like, whether it's by performance or whether it's by role, we also want diversity. And so that's being amplified through these AI tools. That's an ethical question because while we say that we want to be gender neutral or want to be more inclusive and diverse, it's hard. Like, it's a catch-22 in my opinion, right? I mean, how do you then, if you remove the name, you remove the picture, you remove, that's also a discussion, right? You remove all those personal identifiers from a resume and only hire somebody based on merit. And then whether you do it in person manually or whether you use some tools to do that, then it can, if it's 100% on merit, then it may or may not give you the most diverse team that you're looking for. So how do you tackle that catch-22 in your opinion?
I think it's extremely challenging. I think this is sort of like a rapidly emerging subdiscipline inside of recruiting to try to figure out how do we, both in an ethical way and at scale, try to bring diversity into the team. One thing that we do in our company, which I think is I would say is maybe the right approach, not saying that all of these are necessarily wrong, is we don't leverage AI. We just ask the question, or we allow companies to ask the question of how people self-identify, and then they can leverage that data in reporting, and that's provided directly from them. Of course, they could make something up and say something that's untrue, but there's no sort of AI guessing at it. And so I think part of the ethical issue is does it just feel icky? We just don't feel good about a computer assessing those types of things about us. It feels icky as a person. I think the tricky thing with AI is that we're now talking about doing something at scale that might require an individual to pay attention and go through 100 resumes over a few hours. You could go through 100 resumes in 5 milliseconds, and so whatever they're doing is amplified dramatically. A good example which was in the news, and so I think probably a bunch of people read it, was an algorithm that Amazon had developed to try to judge whether or not somebody is likely to be hired long term. So that's what a lot of recruiting AI is trying to do. It's saying, I would like to predict who is likely to be hired for the role among the people who are in this applicant pool. And so the training data that it might leverage is a bunch of decisions that recruiters actually made. And so recruiters looked at a bunch of resumes and they decided this person gets advanced and this person doesn't. And Amazon, it seems like they were using certain criteria that probably a human wouldn't, but a computer might pick up on. So they might say, you know what? I've noticed that the name John is correlated with being hired as a software engineer. Of course, making something up like this. And so if it notices something like that because you're running an unsupervised learning algorithm or something like that, over the data, then it's going to say this is predictive. I can see that this is correlated with somebody being hired, so I'm going to start using this criteria and making judgments about whether somebody should be advanced. A human might not do that, but that might be something else that so that criteria might be ignored, and it might be amplified just by having an AI train off of that type of data set.
How do you feel about creating algorithms by putting different weights on different parameters, right? Like basically, if you're an alum of a particular, or if you have studied from a particular university, for example, or if your keywords match the keyword in the resume, you might be more qualified. And what about the softer skills like leadership and communication skills? Those cannot be quantified easily. How do you make sure that the AI algorithm is designed to pick up the best type of candidates for that kind of role?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I don't know that it's easy to assess how good somebody is at something, just by having them included in the resume. So I could include the keyword Java like 15 times, and that doesn't necessarily mean I'm great at Java, but it probably means I had a bunch of experience that would let me be good at that. I mean, for leadership, that's not usually something where there's like a good resume bullet that necessarily lands. Instead, they're describing a time when they did something that looks like leadership, and so it's a lot harder for a matching algorithm that's just looking at discrete terms and trying to figure out which ones are most frequent and bubbling that type of thing up. But maybe I'll get into ranking algorithms for a minute, and I think you also touched maybe on another topic which I could get into later, which is AIs as applied to things like video interviewing and video assessments. So maybe I'll start with ranking algorithms. So if I have like 1,000 candidates coming into the top of the funnel, and I have some algorithm that's putting a sort order on them. So it could be totally random. It could be sorted by when they applied, which is sort of the default thing that a lot of these systems do. Or there are companies that specifically focus on ranking candidates, and they're trying to use relevant criteria. So one of the first things they do is they say, what are the attributes of this job? Let me look at the job description and try to do a bunch of keyword matching. So it's probably the first thing they do. They say, is this person similar enough to the description that's in here that they're worth bubbling up? Then they might look at other attributes, which are based off of not necessarily just a pure AI, but based off of like a knowledge graph. So if I have a knowledge graph that sort of represents, the relatedness of companies to each other, and might include some metadata about how prestigious they are, how much revenue they're making, how many employees they have, or at a university, where did they sit in the U.S. News, rankings, or something like that. Then they might provide some additional weight to say that this person is a good candidate. Because they went to a top school. That's not necessarily going to be true, but they are taking a lot of the same types of factors that might be proxies for somebody being smart, somebody staying at a company for a long time, so they're reliable or whatever it is. They're taking those types of proxies from the resume and deciding to rank people off of them. Another one that I've seen included is the grammar good in the resume. So you do see ranking algorithms using a huge range of different features to decide who to bubble up to the top. They're not often doing a ton of automated rejecting from what I've seen, which is, I think, a worry that people have. They're like, oh, well, I apply into some system and there's a machine that's going to automatically reject me by looking at my resume. I actually haven't seen a ton of that happening in our industry. It's certainly not something that happens in Greenhouse. People might configure some kind of rule that says if you're under 18 and you've answered the question, I'm under 18 and you're automatically not legal to work in this job, they might send you an auto rejection or something. But they don't usually trust an AI to reject a bunch of people at scale from the ranking algorithms.
But it seems to me like they would, if they are using AI to source the candidates or bubble the candidates to the top, that then in some way they are using some kind of rejection mechanism, which is not manual but automated, right? So the worry is that I'm not even going to make it to the first round on the table of somebody who is going to look at my resume, right? So
yeah, and I think that's exactly right. So it's sort of like implicit rejection. It's like you may not be getting an email saying you're disqualified, where the entire process was run by an AI. But by only have a recruiter only has so much time, and they only look at the top, let's say 10% that the ranking algorithm provides. You're right. It is almost like having an automated rejection for the bottom 90%, according to this algorithm, right? And so I think just getting into it a little bit more. Most of those algorithms today are black box algorithms, and with somewhat limited feature engineering that's happening. So sometimes they are doing better feature engineering. They're not picking up on like Johns are correlated with being hired, so we're gonna use John. A lot of them are supervised learning algorithms with enough feature engineering that they're at least trying to use some relevant criteria. A thing that they don't do generally, and I have seen examples where they do, so I know that there are companies working on this, is to try to ensure that there's model explainability, and you can say, this is how we got to this decision. And the classic example, which I'm sure has already been referenced in this conference, and I'm sure it will be referenced again by somebody else before the thing is through. If we think about the Fair Credit Reporting Act, I don't know how familiar everyone is with that. I assume they are, but just to reiterate for anyone who's not, there is an act that was created to ensure equal access to credit for people in the United States. And so an example of criteria that was bad that was being used by banks in the past might have been to say, people in this zip code correlate highly with default. So they're unlikely to pay their debt. And so the consequence of that might mean that as an individual, you had a perfect credit record, you were credit worthy by all measures, but because you lived in, let's say, a low income neighborhood where they had witnessed default before, you were automatically rejected. The outcome of that type of decision meant that people of color in the United States were less likely to have equal access to credit. And so the outcomes were the significant life-altering disparate impact across a bunch of different groups. So the act came out and said, you have to provide a reason if you decline credit. What is the specific reason? And it certainly can't be that they live in this neighborhood. That is insufficient. And so there's sort of good criteria that got mapped out. It's like, well, you could reject someone for not having enough credit history. You could reject somebody for being late on payments. You could, so there were sort of valid criteria that you could use, but you had to be able to explain what they were. And so even though credit card companies are obviously leveraging machine learning in order to make credit decisions for people now, because you can get a credit decision in 30 seconds or 60 seconds or whatever it is online, they're doing so in an explainable way. So they're leveraging things like decision trees. They're communicating this is the criteria.
The why
same thing doesn't happen in hiring yet, but I think it will.
That was exactly my point. So what I'm hearing from you is like the transparency, the explainability, the AI that's moving in that direction, less black box and more of why people should be able to understand the weights that were given and how it was altered, how the AI came to this decision, whether they are acceptable or not. And That brings up an important point. Greenhouse works with so many different vendors, like you were telling me, and also different companies directly, as well as vendors who make these AI for hiring softwares. So, does anyone measure false positives or false negatives of their decisions or of their decisions of their models in like 2 years, 5 years? Because that would be one way to understand. I don't know if the industry is doing this, and I want to find out if they are. Because yes, we can say at one point that this is not the right fit, and manually also we could do that, but it would be good to go back and reflect on it and say, hey, 2 years later, 5 years later, look at the trajectory of this person. This person would have made a great fit, but for whatever reason our algorithm didn't pick it up and rejected him or her.
That's a good question. I have not seen longitudinal studies that communicate anything like that. If anyone has, I'd certainly be interested in seeing it. I do think that one thing that's happening, so we're better able to track outcomes at like a group level today than we are at an individual level. So again, we don't have longitudinal analysis on like would this person have been a good hire.
Okay.
So inside of Greenhouse, for instance, because people are self-identifying and saying, I am of this particular blend of demographic characteristics, we actually report on pass-through rates all the way through the funnel for each cohort, so for each group. So you can see, is there a drop off or a decrease in, one particular subset? So I'll just give a couple of examples of the type of analysis that people might be doing, and this helps detect discrimination, not necessarily at the individual level, but maybe at the group level or bad process design. So if I see that, let's say, Asian American men, have a pass-through rate all the way through to interview X, and then we start seeing a higher drop-off for that group than another group, there's probably something to look into there. Like what are the reasons underneath that are causing a disparate drop-off rate? And so, there's one that's sort of at the, I think is fairly prevalent that we've seen, which is you might see differences in how different genders handle different types of testing environments. And so this is something that I don't think has been studied at enough scale that I'd feel like confident saying one way or another. But you might see that like a drop-off rate for an in-person tech out interview might be higher among some women than it would be among men. So what is it about the design of the interview itself that might be creating a sort of disparate, impact on one group versus another, whether it's explicit bias or implicit bias. Those types of things can only be analyzed if we can start looking at the outcomes and see if there are in fact differences between one group and another.
I want to take an audience question here. Alberto wrote down, says, how do you, not this one, how do you define and measure transparency for AI algorithms and models?
How do you define and measure transparency? Well, I think maybe I can ask a follow-up question and see if it comes back in the chat. Which parts of transparency are we talking about? Like how a hiring decision was made, just so I narrow in on the right thing.
Alberto, feel free to post your question in the chat, and we'll pick it up. We'll come back and pick it up.
If I don't see it again, I can get back to it. I mean, I think probably transparency would say these are the specific criteria that were used in order to make the decision, just like in the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And that there should probably be a subset of valid criteria that can be used. So, there's probably stuff that should not be included and some stuff that, should be included. You are trying to make some judgments, but, certainly irrelevant details about, whether you'd be successful in the role should not be considered. And we should be communicating, I think, to candidates, what the underlying reasons were. There are some companies that do this manually. They say, here's why we decided not to move forward, and certainly that's generally appreciated by candidates to understand what the reason is. As we deal with at-scale processes where AIs are making more of the judgments, like in the ranking case that we discussed before, I think transparency looks like communicating the specific criteria that AI used in order to put you towards the top or the bottom of the list for a given role.
Yeah, but in today's hiring process, I know that all you get is a letter, whether you were accepted or rejected, even in whether it is done manually or using a tool. They don't give you any specifics on how and where you fell short. It's like, oh, this, and to go one step further, they'll say, oh, it's not you. It was not a good fit for the team. So, I mean, it's a blanket statement. There is no learning experience there. There is no way you can improve on your skills, whether it's upskilling or interviewing skills or writing a job, like the resume skills. Like, you have no clue where you fell short.
Yeah, there are certain things that are hard to express to candidates, and I think people avoid them. So, like, things that are relatively easy to express that people will say is, we assessed your ability in Java, and you didn't. Sorry, my 3-year-old is crying in the background.
No worries.
We assessed your ability in Java, and we felt like you didn't do enough stepwise refinement. You didn't add interfaces where necessary. Whatever it is, some technical thing. People are totally happy to do that because somebody can go off and learn it and get better at it the next day. That's not necessarily the case with things like communication skills, like you spoke, but you didn't speak that good. Like, so, we're not going to hire you for that reason. Or like, you're supposed to be a salesperson and I wasn't sold, it just feels a little bit more personal when certain criteria are used. Those criteria are not used in credit decisions. So I think it is a more difficult problem because there's I just didn't like you and want to work with you every day.
It's hard to do it also at scale, these things, to send a personalized rejection letter for everyone applying to it. But yeah, I would think so that if this is a learning experience, at least maybe not the first level, but the second level, if the candidate has reached the interview level, some level of personal transparency, again, this all comes back to explainability and transparency, would be good. And I want to touch upon an important topic here that we barely scratched the surface on: pitfalls in using AI assessment for video interviewing. I know that is becoming more and more common, especially with COVID. Like, we can't meet in person, so we are doing this whole conference virtually. So how do you assess like the overall personality of a person through a video interview?
Yeah, so this is another sort of newsworthy thing that has popped up. So there are all of these video interviewing platforms. And by video interviewing, I'm not talking about like you get on Zoom with somebody else, but instead there's a list of questions and you're supposed to answer them to a camera, and then somebody's supposed to watch the video later. Right. And so that's the fundamental thing about like how these tools are supposed to work. The features that have been added on to some of these systems included things like, does this person pronounce their words clearly? Do they sound confident? There's a bunch of different sort of dimensions of personality assessment that it's trying to leverage machine learning in order to sort of identify. The problem is, it's not just a training set problem. Some of the things that they're trying to identify are fundamentally problematic. So, if somebody, so one of the potential outcomes of something like this is, let's say that I'm judging whether somebody speaks clearly and they come from a background where they're not a native English speaker, or they are a native English speaker, even in America, and they come from a region where they have a regionalized accent. That's not relevant criteria in whether somebody can do the job or whether somebody even speaks English well. And so to have an AI use a factor like that to determine how well spoken somebody is can be fundamentally problematic and create disparate impact. So that's the video assessment stuff. I know we're running short on time, so
So how is supervised learning used today to train ML hiring models?
Well, I think it probably depends on the point in the process. So there's things like, let's see. There's certainly conversational AI models. That's actually a big one that we didn't even really touch upon. A lot of times when you land on someone's career page now, there's like a little chat bot, and it's AI. That's a lot of that's driven off of watching how a real human would respond. Things like ranking algorithms are usually trained as they're supervised learning. They're looking at the choices that you made, and they're trying to predict the same types of choices and then apply roughly the same criteria to the problem. I think those are probably some of the bigger use cases for supervised learning. Other ones are like automated technical assessments. So they'll look at code, some code snippet, and they'll look at things like how complex is your method, and how did you name it, and blah blah blah. But then at a level up, they're also looking at how did users make judgments over these things. And then I see
I'll take two more questions. Munish Khandelwal asked, on that note, do the AI models making judgments self-correct?
I think my firm answer is it depends. Are people actually updating their models, or are they using live models that take in new information, or are they training up a model and deploying it to production and letting it sit for a while? So if we look at things like guessing at race or gender based on an image, they're using off-the-shelf models that try to do that type of thing for the most part, and they're not making major updates to them or changing them over time. So I think it's kind of a mix.
Girish asks, who gets to decide the rules of the game when establishing AI models? How does one minimize self-bias that could get generated when creating these? Interested in learning how you do it.
So we actually don't create AI models for recruiting for precisely a bunch of these sort of fraught reasons. So we do try to make sure that there's human intervention, in these types of consequential decisions wherever possible. If somebody is creating an automated rule, like people who are over 18 or under 18, someone under 18 cannot work at this job. That type of thing is possible, but that reflects a real concrete rule that somebody would be implementing manually, on their own. In the industry generally, though, is it true that these AI models are doing sort of sketchy stuff? For sure. Sorry, I see another question coming in as well.
That's the last one we have time for. Okay. One of our team is asking,
how do you handle
cultural fit?
Culture fit metrics. So I don't know that. So culture fit is actually something that is controversial in and of itself. Do you want to hire more people who fit the existing culture that you already have? Maybe yes, maybe no. Maybe there's specific attributes you want to hire for, like entrepreneurialism or something along those lines. But you don't necessarily want to hire people just like you. It's certainly not a good way to build a diverse team. So the lens that people have tried to shift to from culture fit is to culture add. Are they someone who is going to add to our culture and make it better over time? So when you're thinking about culture add, you're actually making sort of a diverse assessment. Like, is this person going to bring something that somebody else hasn't already brought to our organization? And so the idea of leveraging data to make that type of decision gets harder and harder because your sample size starts shrinking down for what you're really looking for.
Thank you, Mike. This has been one fantastic conversation. I learned something new. I'm sure our audience did as well. There's just so many things that we couldn't cover in the interest of time, but I'm sure we'd love to have you back and pick your brain on many such topics. Thanks again for being here. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for having me. See you.